So Ecclesiastes chapter 6 and verse 1. And I want us to think tonight, okay, how do we make the most of our lives? If you remember chapter 5, we walked through, even if you weren't here, you can kind of take and review real quick, and you would understand that beginning in verse 8 and walking through the end of that, he's thinking of all the things that God has blessed him with, of silver and abundance, and all the things that he has gathered in life, but also how those things did not bring him happiness. And then in chapter 6, we kind of dive into something a little bit more to help us understand a little bit better. So how do we make the most of life? Or how do we gain happiness in life? How do we gain peace? How do we gain purpose in life? And I believe these are kind of like two sides of a coin, chapter 5 and chapter 6. Let's begin in verse 1 and read down through verse 12, Ecclesiastes chapter 6. I'm going to read the New King James Version, but I'm also going to reference some other translations to kind of help us understand a little bit better tonight. In chapter 6, he says, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity. This is an evil affliction. If a man begets 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than he. For it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. Though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to one place? All the labor of a man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have, who knows how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity, and grasping for the wind. Whatever one is, he has been named already. For it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun?" If Ecclesiastes chapter 5 is accumulating all the riches of this world, the silvers, the goods, the labors, all these things to which it describes, and it does not bring happiness, then how do we measure our lives? The theme kind of shifts, and it's dealing with circumstances now. Matter of fact, when we read through chapter 6, we say, man, it's kind of confusing, some of the words and some of the thoughts, and Solomon begins to pour out his understanding of life. But how do we balance these things? How do we look? How do we understand the vanity of gain and honor? How do we begin to look at the things that God has blessed us with and the things that God takes away from our life? We look at life in two different directions, right? And I want us to think about these tonight. One is a direction. Good things. What is God going to teach? I prayed, hey, what are we going to learn? Okay, if anything, through the pandemic, through the racial issues, you want me to learn through this? How do you want to develop who I am as a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ? A positive look, but then a negative look. Now, I know none of y'all have that, okay? Nobody that came tonight has a negative outlook, right? Andrew does. All right. He was the one pointed at. And he really didn't. But let's think about it, okay? Let's think the way we perceive things that God brings into our life. Let's think about the good things and the bad things, the positive things and the negative things. Let's think first of all about the negative view of life, okay? And really, verse 1 all the way through down in verse 8 teaches us a little bit about the negative view of life. The negative thought, the way that we observe things, the way that we filter things through our life. One translation defined the first two verses in this way. I like this, okay? Here is a tragedy I have observed under the sun, and it weighs heavily on humanity. God gives a man riches, wealth, and honor so that he lacks nothing of all he desires for himself, but God does not allow him to enjoy them. Now imagine this. Instead, a stranger will enjoy them. This is futile and a sickening tragedy. Now what do we look at when we think about the negative view? Okay, we think about the poor, okay? I don't have anything. I've accumulated all this, but what happens is the New King James says a foreigner comes in, as this translation says, okay, this is another man, and he comes in, a stranger, and God allows him to enjoy everything that I've had. But think about the things that you and I have in life, the things that God has blessed us with. Most of us have a nice place to go with a swap. What would happen if God says, you know what, hey, I'm going to move you. I'm going to give another person all the blessings you have, not wives, okay? But all life, we'll say, all right, I'm going to put you in poverty. And everything that you've worked hard, I'm going to give someone else. We would say, oh, woe is me. Poor, a poor view. I don't have anything. You see, we can work and we can get all these things because that's what it tells us there in verse 1. He says, hey, all these things have come. There's evil, though, and a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor. Sounds all kind of great things, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to eat of it. How do we translate that? One Old Testament scholar, Temper Longman, he notes it this way. He says, as a matter of fact, chapter 6 and verse 1 through verse 6, he claims that many well-off people cannot experience the enjoyment described in verse 17 through verse 19 of chapter 5 because God will not allow them to enjoy it. Now that's a hard reality for us to begin to comprehend. Why would God bless us with something and not allow us to enjoy it? I like the description that I read. It says, the fact is, anyone can look at their financial situation with a negative view. Now, we all know people like this, all right? We all know people that, man, they might have more than any of the rest of us in the church, but they're going to look at it in a negative way. They're going to look and say, man, we just need a little bit more. That's what greed sets in our life sometimes. But this man defined it this way. He says, the reality is money is like a river. And you're going to understand where this comes. It flows in, and what happens? It flows out. And instead of complaining that a river leaves us, he said we should be happy that the river came by in the first place. But that's hard to do. Solomon, though, reminds us there are frustrations. There's one thing that we face. If getting rich is our chief aim, and the frustrations that come with wealth, we understand that God can take that from us. We can look at a negative view. We could complain, or we could say, God, thank you for blessing me with it, even if it was just for a little while. Now, we could look at finances. We could look at every area of our life. We could think about the people in our lives. Say, God, I thank you so much for my life. Even when God takes them home, and for the time that we had, or the blessings that we have, homes or careers, whatever it may be. But thank God that we had them. Even if somebody else saw it, even if they're gone now. But this is the way that we look. And if we're not careful, we have a poor, a negative view of these things. Warren Wiersbe says it this way. Warren Wiersbe says, enjoyment without God is merely entertainment. And it doesn't satisfy, but enjoyment with God is enrichment. And it brings true joy and satisfaction. It's kind of like this. You and I, we could say this way. All right? God could bless us with everything in the world, but if we didn't know the Lord, it would be miserable. Now, people like to think, hey, I'm not, but we find out, comes to the end, they are. But man, if God would just give me a little bit, but with His presence, everything changes. So we want to make sure we don't take the negative outlook of poor, of being poverty. We also don't want to pick up on the negative outlook of pity. We know people who like to have their own pity parties. They host them all the time. In verse 3, we see a little bit about that. It says, if a man begets 100 children and lives many years, I know many of you men are thinking, oh Lord, 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness. Or indeed he has no burial. I say that a stillborn child is better than he. That's a pretty strong statement, but let's think about it. Let's go with it, okay? Let's think about pity. Things like prosperity and children and long life. These are expressions of what? Those are God's blessings. And oftentimes we look and we try to determine God's blessings. Oftentimes our older people is like, why is God leaving me here? Oftentimes when younger people are taken from us, we say, God, why didn't you give them more? But these are some of God's blessings. They're an indicator that God has put favor upon us. Yet they don't necessarily mean that He's given life, meaning to life. So we want to make sure that we comprehend, that we look and say, okay, if God has blessed us with all of this, and I don't think any of us in here tonight have 100 children and lives many years, but we look and say, wait, what are the blessings that God gives me? And how do I make sure that I take meaning of life? And I don't look at the negative view. And I don't look at the things that God has taken from me. I don't want to fall into the pity. One commentator wrote it this way. He says, the ultimate meaning, satisfaction, and profit that Solomon and every human being after him seeks will have to come from something other than simply possessing the blessings. So for you and I, if we were to gain a lot of things, okay, I don't think any of y'all are here tonight, so you know what? I've got more money than I ever know what to do with. Maybe Mark, right? Not as long as you got. If God was to bless us, though, in an extraordinary way, that would be good. But what's the greatest blessing? Understanding that it's God. To make sure that we're generous back to Him. Understanding in our lives the many days that God gives us, but also to make sure our lives count for Him. So He's saying, hey, the ultimate satisfaction profit that Solomon was looking for, and all the people who ever came after him, is not in the possessions, but those that provided those blessings. And without contentment, that is, without seeing the good in things, the good in things of life, they're great benefits. And the man in these verses seemed to have it all. Worth a fortune. He was famous, really. But he didn't understand this value. He didn't balance things well. Martin Luther, the great theologian, said, he called these verses a description of a rich man who lacks nothing for a good and happy life and yet does not have one. The poor, the pity. Think about this, the proud. The proud. In verse 7 and verse 8, the Bible says, all the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? Let's think about this proud, okay? Let's think about this. A man's labor. He's gained all these different things that are good for him, but not for his soul. He's never satisfied. We live in a world that we could say, you know what, it looks a lot like that. We know people that get distracted. People that want to work every single day, all day long, because I want to gain. And then in the end, what happens? God takes them home. They've never enjoyed anything. Now, work is good. The Bible teaches us that. We're going to work. We're going to eat. It'll be a blessing. But if we get distracted, our eyes on the things that, the blessings, and not on the blesser, we have a negative view. Let's look at the positive view. We always like positive, okay? We like positive thoughts. We like positive people. We like a positive view on lives. And let's think, okay, we're going to stick with those P words. We're going to prioritize. I can learn to be content. Listen to the way this translation reads, verse 9. Better what the eyes see than wandering desires. This too is futile and a pursuit of the wind. Better what the eyes see than the wandering desire. In verse 9, Solomon is teaching us, I believe, kind of a lesson that many of you are familiar with. A bird in the hand is what? You know? Better than two in the bush. He says, hey, the things that you've got, the things that you can see, the things you possess, They're better than the desires, because you've got them. Proverbs been around for a long time. Solomon said, hey, it's better to have a little and really enjoy that than to dream about a lot and never attain it. Dreams have a way of becoming nightmares sometimes if our end goals are not focused on the positive. We want to make sure that we're looking at the positive. A key perspective, especially when it comes to money and riches, is contentment. Contentment. There are better things for the eye to see than the wandering desires. Solomon addresses all these different things, but he begins to look at it, and it's not just understanding and the blessings of God, but he also says, hey, we're to practice this. We're to practice this. We're to practice being content. We're to practice enjoying the blessings that God gives us. In verse 10 he says, whatever one is, he has been named already, for it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. In other words, who is he talking about? God, all right, the Lord. And to understand, hey, we're to practice this. I can live to the best of my potential with what God has given. Verse 10 all the way through verse 12, he kind of gives us a theme, a thought, the meaning of life, satisfaction, and fulfillment. And Proverbs in chapter 7 emphasizes human limits and the work of God. So we have to look, we have to understand some things. We're to practice this. And when we do practice this, when we're content with what God gives us, here's what He does for us. He gives us a peace. And in verse 11, he talks about that peace. He says, since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? He said, okay, how are we enjoying life? How are we determining if we're doing the right things? We continue through Ecclesiastes. We see Solomon, he can be frustrated, but also he can look, okay? He can say, hey, there are some things that are not good. What are the things we're doing? We're grasping at the wind. They're vapors, all these things. But he's mentioned that God is in control. God is in control. And He gives us peace. And when we do suffer a good deal of disappointment in life, we begin to understand, hey, God has a purpose in this. And there's a fourth thing that we look at. Okay, we only looked at 3 on the negative, but there's 4 on the positive. There's always more positive than there are negative. In verse 12 he says, for who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow, who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? Now, I like to think about it this way, okay? Has my life made any difference, okay? When I'm gone, all right, what kind of difference have we made? Now, let's think about this, because we're looking at the positive side, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to pray, because I believe every one of us prays. You know what? Hey, I make a difference in the kingdom. Pray that I've been faithful, that I've been a good steward with everything that God has given me. I can make the most of each day. Mr. Jerry and Miss Teddy got here earlier, and hey, we're alive. Every day is a blessing. We understand that. God has a purpose. George Orwell wrote many years ago in his story 1984, he wrote, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. It's evident, he said, that we've been unable to exercise any control over our destiny, yet we persistently seek to discover what the future holds. You can lay awake at night wondering about the next day, or the next moment, or the next year, or the next generation that comes. And the reality is God has created human beings in this image to love and to honor Him with everything, and every day and every moment, to love and respect our neighbors, the people that are closest to us, the people that are far away, to love the planet, really, everything that He gives us. That's how the universe is. So how is man better? For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun?